Good morning, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Jeffrey Shear, and I'm in the Business and Trust and Estate Department here at Schoeneck King. And my quick elevator speech, what I always let people know when they ask me what I practice, is that I represent small and mid-sized businesses from startup through succession, anything in between, including partnership agreements and shareholder agreements and transactional work and estate planning when you're moving the business to the next generation, and anything else that comes up for small to mid-sized businesses. So that's what I do, and this is actually my first webinar. So it's the first time I'm just talking to a screen, and usually I'm talking to live people, and there's, I'll tell a few jokes and there's some laughing. So I'll have to ask my producer today if there's a laugh track or something like that they can put in here as we go through the presentation, and maybe I say something amusing, but we'll see about that. So we'll get right into this. Today's topic is succession planning. Can it just wait? And I think by the end of our presentation today, you'll have that answer, but I'm sure you can all guess what the answer is. But let's get going. So what we're going to discuss today are a number of items. We're going to cover a lot of ground. So the first is really, why is the succession plan important? And I think that as you see what we're going to go through today, you'll realize why it's important. And it's important to make sure that the business that you operate continues past your involvement. And a lot of times, businesses are first or second generation businesses, and the question becomes, all right, what's the next step? And that's where we really need to start thinking about a succession plan. And as you'll see today as we go through things, a succession plan really takes a lot of different forms. And it could take a form of passage of the business to the next generation through estate planning techniques, or it could take the form of a sale to a third party. So it's important for the plan itself is important to really think about how you're going to make that happen, but also it's probably important for you to know that you're going to find a way to continue the business beyond your involvement. We're also going to discuss the options that can and I say should be considered when putting together a succession plan. There are a lot of different ways that a succession plan can be implemented, and I've already mentioned both the estate planning and passing on to the next generation or a sale to a third party. We're going to go through some of those options today. Hopefully, I'm going to leave you with a few nuggets that you can take back, or maybe you'll have questions that you want to ask later or even during the chat here. But I think as we go through this today, you'll see there are lots of different things that you can consider for continuing the business beyond your involvement. We're also going to talk about certain steps that can be taken to prepare your business for sale. You can't just think one day you're going to put your business up for sale or for succession and think you're in a position to do that. So one of the things we're going to talk about is a series of things that you should look at kind of introspectively in your business to prepare your business for that next step and for that succession. So you're putting the business in the best position it can be, whether it's passing it on to your kids or the next generation, or whether it's a sale to a third party. And the last thing we're going to look at is how you can increase the value, increase your enterprise value. And we'll look at a few techniques that may help to increase the value of your business if you're looking at a sale to a third party. So those are the things we're going to look at today, maybe not necessarily in that order, but we're going to cover those 4 highlights. So hopefully after this presentation, you'll have some ideas of when you should start thinking about things, what you should start thinking about, and you'll be able to move on to that next step. So the first thing we want to talk about is, really, what is succession planning? What does it mean? And it means a whole bunch of different things. And I think, we covered I've already mentioned a few of these. So let's look at these in a little more detail here. The first is transfers within the family. A lot of people set up there are a few different reasons people set up a business. Some people set up a business just to sell it. Some people set up a business that they want to operate for a long time. It's going to be their retirement. Some people want to set up a business because it's their passion. And when you look at the different reasons why you set up a business, you look at maybe different ways that you can pass the business on, or you can, make sure that that business exists for the next, next person that wants to run it. So the first thing we look at is, transfers within the family. That's a big part of succession planning. Anytime I sit down with a client, we start talking about succession planning, and I always ask, are there children in the business? I say children, but oftentimes they're probably my age or older. Is the next generation, is G2 involved in the business? And if the answer is yes, we really start going down a pathway of talking about how to transfer the business to that next generation, how to do it in a tax advantageous way, how to do it in a way that accomplishes the goals and the objectives of the business owner, and really in a way that accomplishes the goals and objectives of the generation 2 who's receiving the business. I always say in a succession plan, when you're dealing with passing the business from generation 1 to generation 2, or generation 2 to generation 3, we need to marry the goals and objectives of both generations. Generation 1 may want to make sure that they get value for their business, but that value may not equate to something that generation 2 can then pay for the business. So I always say to people, we can't put together a plan that results in generation 2 having to buy the business and eating, tuna fish and peanut butter and jelly for 10 years. Although I do like both of them, and I still take both of them to lunch sometimes. But the real thing I'm getting at is we don't want to put generation 2 in a position where they're taking on the business and really don't have enough money to support their family. So that's the first bullet there of what does succession planning mean in terms of transfers within the family. It's a transfer from G1 to G2, or G2 to G3, or 3 to 4, and how do we best accomplish that? Another form of succession planning that we look at are management transitions. And this is always the second question I ask. So if there aren't family members in the business to accept the business, then I always ask, what does your management team look like? Do you have a strong chief executive officer, or chief operating officer, chief financial officer? Do you have a strong sales team in place that possibly can buy out the business from you? So that's another thing that succession planning can mean, is really an internal buyout. And I've seen this, really be successful in situations where we have family-owned local businesses that don't have that next generation in place, but really have a desire to stay in the area that they are in, whether it's Central New York or Western New York or some different area. They say, I want to keep my business here. I want the employees to stay here, and I want the economy to continue benefiting from the business that I have here in the community. And oftentimes, when we have those goals in mind, we do look to a management transition. Because the feeling is the management will keep the business there. Next thing that a succession plan could mean is a sale to a third party. And this is exactly what it sounds like. This is, we don't have family members, we don't have a management team, so let's go out and look for a third party to buy the business. And that's part of a successful succession plan as well. I've worked with lots of clients who are in their 60s or 70s. Maybe they do have kids, but they're not in the business. So then we start looking at, all right, let's go out there and really put the company in a position to be sold. And in that case, the sale to the third party is really part of that succession plan. So succession plan isn't always passing it on to the next generation. It can mean, many different things here, and that's what you're seeing in terms of a management transition or a sale to a third party. And the last bullet here in terms of what succession plan meaning is that you really can't have a successful succession plan without also coordinating it with your estate and asset protection plan. I think doing a succession plan, passing the business on to the next generation, or even a sale, needs to really be coordinated with an estate or asset protection plan to make sure that once you have the value of the business in your estate, so now you've liquidated your interest in the business, you've gone from stock to cash, and you have cash in your hand, we want to make sure that if you should pass, that cash, your maybe equity investments or other investments, get to the next generation you want it to get to, or get however you want it to get. So we're going to talk about that during this conversation as well. So why is succession planning important? Well, it's important to accomplish your goals and objectives. And I think, here, on this bullet, on this slide, I really talked about, the fact that it doesn't always succeed. Majority of businesses fail by the third generation. And a lot of people set up their businesses just with the intent of selling it. So, succession planning is important to make sure that maybe you do want to sell it. So that third bullet on here is, really up your alley, and you want to sell it, and that's your succession plan. But it's really important to make sure that you don't fall within these first two bullets. And I've seen plenty of succession plans that do succeed because we have balanced the goals and objectives of both generation one and generation two. I've seen businesses that have gone past the third or fourth generation. I remember sitting with a client earlier this year and counting out the generations that have been involved in the business and starting to plan for the next generation. So a lot may fail by the third generation, but if you start addressing your succession planning, your succession sooner rather than later, you can avoid some of these pitfalls that are here. I remember, and as we go through this, you'll realize that I like to tell a lot of stories. I remember a long time ago represented a very successful business, and gentleman had his son in the business and wanted to start a succession plan, and luckily he talked to us, when he wasn't older. He talked to us when he was, probably in his, late 50s, early 60s. We were able to put a plan in place. He had a very valuable business at the time. He was going to have all sorts of estate tax issues, which we're going to get into a little later. And we're able to put a plan in place that actually passed the business to his son over a period of a number of years. Over a period of 10 or 15 years, passed the business to his son. His son became the majority owner of his business. We had very minimal estate and gift tax consequences. And when the father passed away a few years ago, it was sad that he had passed away, but at the same time, we didn't have any estate tax issues, and we had successfully passed that business on to the next generation in a manner that he had wanted to do. So that's really why it's important. It's important to address these things early to make sure that we can be in a position for the succession to succeed. All right. So the next piece is, are you ready? And here is, the answer to this question is really on an individualized basis. So one person may be ready at 40, another person may be ready at 50, another person at 60, or another person at 70 still. So what you really have to determine is what your current motivation is. All right, what are your goals for both your personal goals and your business goals? And this is really where, as a business owner, you have to really be introspective and think about, all right, do I want to retire by the time I'm 65 or 70? Or do I want to retire by the time I'm 60? And when I retire, I need X amount of dollars, or I need a certain amount of cash flow. So, these are things that you should be thinking about well in advance of the time as to when you want to be in that position to hand over not necessarily hand, but to pass that business on, whether it's the next generation or a sale. So you have to also look at your business, and is your business in a place where you want it to be, and is it in a place where it should be to maximize the value on a sale, if that's what you're going to do. So I think that, looking at the current motivation and what your goals are, and thinking about that sooner rather than later is going to put you in a better position to effectively pass your business on. And I say that whether it's a transfer to your family members or whether it's a sale, knowing what your goals are, knowing what your motivation is, sooner than later is going to allow you to really start your planning in a way to avoid estate or gift tax, or to maximize the value of your business. I remember years ago, I was with a family, and we had multiple members of the same generation in the family, and we were trying to work on a succession plan, and we sat down one time finally, and I said, what's everybody's goal and objective? Where does everybody want to be in 1, 3, 5, 10 years? We went around the room, we came up with an idea, and it was pretty enlightening for everybody. And through that discussion, we were able to come up with a succession plan that addressed each person's needs and desires, but also protected the company long term. And that was really important to know what those motivations are. Figuring out if you're ready means also making sure you have the right team in place. And I say here, there's always a deal team: accountant, lawyer, banker, investment advisor. And I'm not just saying this necessarily to make sure that I'm employed, but I think having, so that's where I could use a laugh track, I think. But I think having your deal team in place, having the people who know your business best, but also know how to work transactions, whether it's, again, a family business transfer or whether it's a sale, having them around the table, having them and their knowledge base around the table is really important. And it may not necessarily be your banker or your investment advisor right off the bat, but I would make sure that as you start thinking about your succession plan, you do involve your accountant and your lawyer to have a discussion about what your hopes and dreams are and what your goals are, and get everyone to start thinking about how we accomplish those goals. And the last thing here is when to start the plan. And I can't emphasize enough, it's never too early to start thinking about what your succession plan is. If there's a desire to transfer within the family, it's a great idea to start that sooner than later. If you have members of the family that are responsible in the business, so we can really minimize estate and gift tax consequences of a transfer. It's never too early to start thinking about, well, if you say, you know what, Jeff, or whoever your lawyer is, I don't want to sell for 3 or 5 years, that's a perfect time to really start thinking about it. So I always say, in general, you should really start thinking 3 to 5 years before you want that succession plan to be effective. But if you're thinking about passing it on to the next generation, even earlier than that would be appropriate. All right, so now let's say you've decided that you're on a 5-year timeline to transfer your business, and you're not sure it's going to be to the next generation or it's going to be a sale to a party. What should I be considering? All right, so here I want to go through a couple of these bullets that talk about here are the things we really should be looking at. And the first, I've mentioned it before, are figuring out my goals and objectives. Am I looking to the business to fund my retirement? Have I put enough money in my retirement where the sale of the business is just going to be some additional monies that I'll be able to use during my retirement? These are all really important questions. I mean, unfortunately, there are some people who have not funded their retirement, and they're looking to the business to be that retirement fund. And that is a very different type of plan than the plan where we're just looking at for the sale of the business to develop a nest egg since I have other retirement funds. So it's another reason why we really need to look at your goals and objectives. The transferring the stock to accomplish estate planning needs. I think we'll get into a little more, but with the changes in the tax law at the end of 2017, the federal estate tax exemption is over $11 million a person or $22 million a couple. The New York State estate tax exemption is about $5.5 million and a person, or just over $11 million for a couple. And what that means is, to the extent that you pass away, if you have assets under that exemption amount in your estate, there's no estate tax consequence. If you have assets over that amount in your estate, you do have estate tax consequences. So, some of the things that we look at in our succession planning is, what's the value of the business and what's the value of your overall estate, and should we be transferring some of your stock out of your name, not just for business succession purposes, but can we achieve some estate tax planning by transferring some interest out of your estate? So that's something else that really needs to be considered as you're going into this. One of the things that we always look at as well is looking at family-owned property. Well, it's real estate or rolling stock or equipment. We want to look at family-owned property that may be used within the business, and then decide as part of your succession plan, whether that family-owned property is part of the succession plan or is outside the succession plan. So by way of example, and the easy example is there's real estate, and the business The business operates on a piece of property that's owned by the individuals. And in this case, the individuals may say, you know what, I want a long-term lease in place, and I will pass the business on to the next generation, or I'll sell it, and I'll have a long-term lease in place, and that'll be part of my retirement plan. And I'll just accept those lease payments for a long period of time, and I'll eventually sell the property, but not right away. That decision may be different than the next person who says, you know what, if I'm going to sell the business, I want to sell everything. Let them buy the real estate, let them buy the business, or I'll pass the real estate on to the next generation, because if I want to get out, I want out of everything. So those are the things to really think about, and I've seen it go both ways in terms of real estate or equipment or other assets that are either outside or inside the business, and whether they're included in the sale or not included in the sale. So that's something else to look at. Sometimes we look at businesses that have multiple divisions in them. And as part of your succession plan, you may want to maintain one division and sell everything else. And if that's the case, that's something to start considering early on in the process rather than later, so you're not spinning off a division and selling everything else all at the same time. We want to make sure we have all the boxes are checked in terms of a tax-free reorganization in that case. And the last thing I have here is the timing of sale considerations. And there's always tax and business considerations for timing a sale. Anytime that a succession plan, whether it's, again, transfer to the next generation or a sale, anytime we start approaching the end of the year, I always ask, is this something we want in this year or next year from a tax position? Do we want the tax issue in 2018, or do we want to push it out to 2019? There are business considerations for timing the sale of a business. Or timing the transfer of business from a valuation perspective. I remember selling a business once that was seasonal, and the value of the business was highest in November. And we were selling the business, and we had a net worth adjustment on the deal, and we decided that our best date of sale was going to be October 31, which happens to be today. But the deal's not closing today. This is years ago. So we decided that our best option was to close the deal on October 31, because that was the highest value of the business, and we really did everything in our power to make that happen. So there's always business considerations in place when you're looking at the succession plan. Okay, so how do you prepare your business for a succession? All right, and I already mentioned, assembling the management team. That's going to be important whether your management team is part of your buyout option, or you want to make sure you have the right management team in place to support Generation 2 as you pass the business on to Generation 2, or to support the next buyer. Very important. You want to review your corporate books and records. So you want to take a look at that minute book that's probably on your shelf, gathering dust, that you may even looked at in years. You want to review that minute book, make sure it's up to date, and start holding what I like to call annual meetings. So if you're considering a sale or some sort of succession in the next few years, I think it's best practice to hold an annual meeting with your lawyer and your accountant, review the past year's events, elect officers and directors, make sure you're approving any corporate actions that require approval, because anyone that buys the business or any generation that wants to take over the business wants to know that they're taking on a business that has clean corporate books and records. Similarly, you want to look at your business records. You want to make sure that your business records are in good order and you don't have everything sitting in a shoebox somewhere. I think in today's day and age, with everything being online or in a cloud, it's probably easier to maintain good financial records and good business records. So I think it's easier, but it's still something that should certainly be looked at. If you're considering a sale to a third party, it's a good idea to look around and improve your facilities, and it may be as simple as a paint job, maybe as simple as like sweeping up the floor, shining up the equipment. But anybody that wants to come in and look at your business for purposes of a purchase is going to walk through. And when they walk through, you want them to see a business with a new coat of paint and shiny floors. So they say this looks like a really nice place, and they focus on the whatever financial information you provided. You don't want them to be distracted by a building that needs a new roof or walls that need to be repainted. So looking at those facilities and putting on some paint or some other minor improvements. We're going to get into why I just said minor, but we're going to look at some improvements to the facility is always a good idea when you're preparing the business for the succession. The other thing to do is to look at your legal, regulatory, and environmental issues. So this really is a boatload of information here. So I'm working with a company, or I've worked with a company, and we started to get it ready for sale. And one of the things we really wanted to do is look at their employment policies. We all know that in New York State, there were some new employment policies that were dictated just recently. We always want to look at the employee handbook and make sure that it's up to date. If it's a company that has any kind of environmental waste or has had environmental problems in the past, we want to look at those and clean those up. So whether we're passing the business on to the next generation or we're selling to a third party, those things should be looked at and cleaned up so that the next operator of the business, the next owner of the business, is taking on a very clean company, and these are things that they don't have to worry about. And the last bullet here I already mentioned before is really determining the right time to close. And again, this is whether you're selling or transferring the business. When is the value of the business going to be what you want it to be? Do you want a relatively high value because you're selling to a third party and there's a net worth adjustment? Then pick a time of year where the value of your business is greater. Do you want a value that's a little bit lower? Because we're doing the transfer for estate planning purposes, and we want to implement certain discounts on the valuation of the business, and I'll explain that in a little bit. Then it may be best to wait to transfer the business. So, by way of example, oftentimes when you're transferring the business for estate planning purposes, and we're doing succession planning for estate planning purposes, we want to gift the shares. And as you gift shares to the next generation, you're using up your lifetime exemption from the estate tax. And those are those $11 million and $22 million amounts that I mentioned earlier. So if you gift stock worth $1 million today, that $22 million exemption as of the date of death is now $21 million because you've used up $1 million of your exemption. So what oftentimes people try and do is they try and minimize the value of the interest that's being gifted. And one way to look at the value is to pick the right time to close. So if you're in a business that happens to be cyclical and you have a few good years followed by a few bad years followed by a few good years, is to transition the business after you have a few bad years. You have a few bad years and you do a valuation, that valuation is going to take into account those bad years and the value is going to be a little bit lower. If you do the valuation after you have a couple of good years for estate planning and gifting purposes, the value is going to be higher and you're going to use up more of your lifetime exemption. So this kind of goes back to the earlier slide of, when's the right time to start thinking about this? And it's never too soon. It's never too soon to say, you know what, I want to plan for succession. I'm 60 years old. My son is 25 and he's in the business and he's been here for 5 years. And I know he's going to stay here. He's showing a passion. It's never too early to start an incremental transition of the business when you're young enough, even at 65, you're young enough to start picking and choosing the right time to gift shares out to the next generation. So one of the goals that we all have, if you're selling to a third party, is maximizing the value of the business. And this goes against, what I just said about minimizing the value for estate planning purposes. So now we're talking about, the succession is going to be a sale of the business to management or to a third party. So one of the things you should be doing is looking at your expenditures, obviously. Reviewing your salaries and administrative costs, trying to reduce those. Only identifying maintenance that needs to be done and that keeps the business going on a short-term basis. You really don't want to implement any major expansion plan or any major equipment purchase that is going to take years to show a profit. Because all you're going to do is you're going to buy it in 1 year and it's going to eat up some of your earnings, and you're not going to see the profit from that for several years. And when someone values the business, they're going to see that you had major equipment purchases, and that's going to bring down your value. All right, so one of the things you want to do is, if you're looking at a succession plan, is doing just what you need to do to see a return on the short term. All right. Another thing I always suggest to people is to take a look at their credit and their business rating, whether it's Dun & Bradstreet or one of these other services. You should know what's out there. You should know what people are saying about you, and you should take steps, if you can, to increase your credit rating and your business rating. That's always going to help maximize your value. Reviewing all of your vendor and your customer and your dealer and distributor contracts should be done. I just met with somebody, and we were looking at a possible sale of the business. And I said, all right, what is your vendor or what do your customer contracts look like? If we have to do an asset sale, can we assign those contracts to the buyer? Can we assign those contracts out from the company to the next owner of the business? So reviewing those contracts now and making sure that they are, they say what you want them to say, and that they contain assignability clauses. If you're doing that now, by the time you go to sell the business in 5 years, hopefully all of your contracts will turn over, and they will all have assignability clauses, or they will be favorable to your company, so that when you go to show the buyer what the company looks like and what the contracts look like, they don't look at a contract and say, oh, this is not the kind of contract I want to assume is going to bring down the value of your company. Another thing that really needs to be done, and this is why you should have your accountant at the table, is looking at your financial statements. And a buyer or a management team or anyone that takes over your business is going to absolutely look at those financial statements. They're going to look at potential overstatements. They're going to look at the inventory list. And they're going to ask if there's obsolete inventory. They're going to look at your accounts receivable, and they're going to ask if there are receivables that are uncollectible. They're going to look to see if you were a reserve for uncollectible accounts receivable. These are things you should be looking at now, and you should be implementing or making the changes now, even if you're not thinking about a succession plan for 5 years, because if in 5 years, all of a sudden you have a line item on your financials for doubtful accounts, that may raise a red flag for somebody. So looking at your inventory on a regular basis, looking at your accounts receivable, making sure that both are healthy and accurate is going to be very important when you're going to that next, going to look to market your business for sale. And the last bullet I had on here is diversifying your customer base if you're able to. This is easier said than done. There are some businesses that are very good about diversifying their customer base, so that if there's a slip in the economy in one area, it doesn't affect their entire business. If you're able to diversify your customer base, I say, you have 5 years to do it. It's a great time to start thinking about it. So this is really just an if possible to diversify your customer base. So if we're looking at a succession plan to the next generation, we're looking at passing the business from G1 to G2 or G2 to G3. There are a lot of things that we have to start thinking about. And the key elements there are really control and equalization. So what do I mean by that? Control of the company is, as you pass the business on to the next generation, there's always an issue of, well, once I pass over 50% of the business to the next generation, I lose control of the company. And that's really something that needs to be talked about with both generations in the room. One is Generation 1 may want to maintain control for as long as possible. Generation 2 may be thinking, well, as soon as I have, majority ownership, I should be in charge of the company. And there's always a balance that can be achieved through this. But I think having that conversation, knowing what people want to accomplish in terms of managerial control of the company is important and really needs to be thought about. Because if we don't think about it, we're going to put ourselves in a position in the long run that's going to be detrimental to the company, because you're going to have a power struggle. The next bullet I have on here is equalization. And what I mean by that is, oftentimes when you're passing the business from Generation 1 to Generation 2, you have multiple kids in Generation 2, some of who may be in the business and some of who may be outside the business. And one of the conversations that's an absolute must to have, and I can't emphasize it enough, is between the current business owner and his or her significant other about what their philosophy is on passing the business to the next generation. Should it be equal among, let's say you've got 3 kids, should it be equal among the 3 kids, whether or not they're involved in the business, because the kids who are involved in the business will also benefit by the fact that they'll be paid a salary? Or should it not be equal because you want to give the business to your child who's mostly involved in the business? There are ways to equalize assets by using a transfer of stock to the child who's in the business and other assets or life insurance policies to the children who are not involved in the business. But I can't emphasize enough having that conversation from the start so that everyone is on the same page as to how the business is being passed. And by everyone, the most important people, if it's applicable, is the business owner and his or her significant other. And I have seen situations where that has not been the case, and it's caused discourse in the long run about transfers that have been equal or unequal for whatever reason. So those are really the 2 key elements, control and equalization. And then they get into the realities of the business succession plan. And, things happen. And these are things that we have to deal with. We can't help it when, well, we can't help it, but, people die or become disabled. And when that happens, we need to have an understanding of what that succession plan is. If business owner passes away, what is the next plan? Like, what is the next step? Is it that his daughter will take over the business? Is it that the spouse will take over the business? Is it that a board will be put in place for the business, which will then be directed to sell the business? So these are the things that we need to think about as we're putting a succession plan in place. Estate tax is a reality. It's not as much of a reality as it once was, but it is still a reality when you're looking at the value of the business. You're looking at the value of other assets you have outside the business. It's one of the things that we really have to consider. I say equity value of the family business. And here, what I really mean is, what's the real value of the business that you're transferring, but what's also the emotional value of the business? And this gets into that issue up above where I've talked about equalization and trying to be fair among the family members when passing that business down. And as I say, being fair, my next bullet is that conflict is inevitable. And, I hate to say it, but I have to, is that, when you're passing the business on to the next generation, there can be conflict, whether it's among the members of the next generation, whether it's among members of the current generation, or whether it's between them about, who's doing what work and who's entitled to control the business. And I think in dealing with all of these issues that I'm talking about, the way to address this most effectively is to start thinking about the succession plan and having that family meeting where you can talk about control and equalization and what happens if there's a death, and trying to avoid these areas where you could have conflict. I've also mentioned tax issues from generation to generation. This really has to do with passing the business from generation 1 to 2 and whether there are gift tax consequences of the transfer. And then there's always the divorce and family issues that have to be considered as you're passing the business down. If a parent is passing the business down to their child who may or may not be married yet, either as the stock or the equity goes into the child's hands, to make sure that there's either a prenuptial agreement or a postnuptial agreement in place, or to make sure that if they're not married, that when they do get married, that there's an agreement in place. So those are the types of things to address because they do happen, and they happen more often than not. And again, a lot of times communication is really the important way to address this. So when we talk about the planning for the business owners and transfers within the family, there are a number of things to think about. This goes back to the previous conversation as well. We have members of the family who are active in the business, who come into the business at a young age, who start building up their rapport within the business, and they're really active in the business. Then you have inactive family members who are not there in the day-to-day operation. Maybe they've gone on to do something else with their life. Maybe they're sitting at home. But those are the two things that we really have to weigh as to whether transfers are to both active and inactive members, or maybe disproportionately between active and inactive members. And again, that's where a lot of times it's, what's your feeling? Do I reward the person who's been in the business, or through extra stock, or since I built the wealth of my business, my family stood behind me, I'm going to pass it equally to my family, and I'll reward those active members who through additional compensation. And the other piece, I talk about transfers within the family is, a lot of times we talk about gifting and we talk about passing the business on through the estate plan, but we have to think about is my sale funding my retirement? I mentioned it before. Have I set up a separate retirement? A lot of times that's not the case, and the business really needs to fund the retirement, and that's a time where we need to weigh a annual payment plan to generation one, because that's their retirement plan, and the ability to make those payments from generation two. So those are the things to think about in that context. So when you're talking about transferring the business within the family, there's a number of methods in which we do that. One is a straight gift. We just take the stock and we gift it either all at once or over a period of years to the next generation. The part that we have to be concerned with, and I mentioned it before, is gifts over an annual exclusion amount. So we can all make gifts of $15,000 a piece to anybody and everybody. You can all make a gift to me of $15,000 this year. It has no gift tax consequences. I'm not suggesting or recommending that you do that. That was a joke, and if we were live, you'd see that. Well, we are live, but if you were in the room with me, you'd probably be laughing. Or maybe not. So, but there's an annual exclusion gift. We can all make a gift of up to $15,000 a year to anybody during the year. That does not impact our lifetime exemption at all. If we make a gift over that amount, it impacts our lifetime exemption. And then we have to start being concerned of potential gift tax issues or estate tax issues as we eat into that lifetime exemption. But gifting the stock is one way to address that. Another way to transfer the business, even within the family, is through a sale. I've done lots of plans where generation one has said, I built up the value, I want to give it to my son or daughter, but I still want to be compensated for it, so let's put a fair plan in place. And that's where we look at structuring a business sale to next generation, either as an asset sale or a stock sale. Sometimes we implement a deferred compensation element into it, which is a continued, it's almost like a salary continuation in some circumstances. The next to G1, it's deductible to the company. It's ordinary income to G1. Sometimes we look at a sale of personal goodwill because the business that we're passing on is so dependent on the personal goodwill of generation one. We can claim that generation one owned that personal goodwill himself and is selling it to generation two. This is typically done through, I'd say, a friendly structure or arm's length deal, or I'd say a friendly structure versus arm's length deal, in that this is when I can sit down at the table with you and with both generations at the table and say, okay, let's put a plan in place that gets everybody where they want to be, gets generation two holding the business, and gets generation one with some cash flow over the next 10 or 20 years so that they can live on, because this is their retirement money. And let's do it in such a way where generation one lives comfortably and generation two may have a little bit of pain in the beginning, but generally lives comfortably after that. And then the third method that we typically look at transferring the business is part gift and part sale. And we kind of take the best of both the first two bullets, and we look at, all right, maybe we can gift part of it over a period of years using some annual exclusion gifting, or maybe using some additional gifts but not eating into our lifetime exemption all that much. And we can do a part sale to make sure that there is some income flowing to generation one. So I mentioned in one of the first slides that you always have to look at your personal planning when you're doing your succession plan. And now when I sit down with people, we talk about estate tax planning and asset protection planning. Because the exemptions right now are relatively high, it's less and less estate tax planning, but it still comes into play. And I think when you're starting to look at your succession plan, even when you're starting to think about it, because of those inevitable events that I mentioned earlier, I mean, death happens. We don't know when. We hope it's not for a long time, but it could happen. So as you start thinking about that succession plan, start reviewing your will and your ancillary documents like your healthcare proxy and your power of attorney. We can use certain estate planning techniques to pass the business on to the next generation. So there are ways that we can transfer if we're concerned with the next generations maybe getting married or having creditor issues, or if they are married and having family issues. We can use trusts to transfer the business as a way to get the business out of generations one's hands and into a vehicle, a trust document that then is for the benefit of generation two, but still has certain creditor protection and asset protection aspects to it. So it's always a good idea as we're looking at your succession plan to look at your estate plan to make sure that it is all consistent and coordinated with your succession plan. So when you're looking at a family business succession plan, there's always difficulties that you can get into. And I've listed here like a number of questions that come into play when looking at what those difficulties could be and how to address them. And again, the best way to address these is through communication and making sure that everyone understands what the eventual plan is. So it's first, is there a succession plan? A lot of times G2 will sit at the table and they'll say, well, I don't know what the plan is. I'm 30 years old, I've been in the business for 10 years or 5 years, and mom or dad, I don't know what the plan is. What is going to happen to the business? And that's the time where we should be having these conversations. Looking at your own assets, looking at your own financial well-being and thinking, have you diversified your assets? Is all of your wealth in the company and in the business, or do you have a separate retirement plan? Do you have separate marketable securities? All right, and as you're thinking about a succession plan and what your plan is, maybe looking at diversifying assets to the extent that you're able to. If you have kids in the business, can they earn business interest? Is that a good way for the next generation to become members or owners of the company by being issued stock or equity in exchange for their efforts they're putting into the company? That's a way to give them ownership without actually gifting interest and without any kind of succession plan on your part, but putting in place some restricted stock award plans or some other plans that could benefit your family members and bring them in as equity members of the company. Looking at multiple generations in the plan, and are the multiple generations in agreement on what the succession plan is? And again, that's getting everybody around that table and having the discussion about what is everybody's goals? How are we going to address each person's goals around the table? And you'd really be surprised as to the conversation that you're going to have when you start thinking about those goals and objectives that everyone has around the table, and then working with someone like me or another trusted advisor on coming up with a plan that helps accomplish all those goals, taking all these different things into account. So when we gift the business to the next generation, and I mentioned this a little earlier, is we really want to look at the value of that gift because it could eat into our lifetime exemption amounts. So we have to, if you do want to start gifting interest to the next generation, I always tell people, well, we're going to have to file a gift tax return. We're going to have to determine the fair market value of the company. There's a cost involved in getting a valuation, but we have to do that because we have to file a gift tax return with the IRS, and attached to that gift tax return is the valuation, which justifies the value of the gift that we're making. Very important because the effect that it could have on your lifetime exemption. Valuation issues, they can be controversial. A lot of times with valuations, there are discounts that are considered. That's my last bullet here. You hear about discounts for lack of marketability because you can't just sell the interest on the open market. You hear about discounts for having a minority interest because you don't have a controlling interest in the company. So that valuation, and these discounts, always come into play because one party may be saying, well, you're applying too many discounts or you're applying too few discounts. So those types of things need to be considered. You need to have the discussion. I always recommend going out to a third party and getting an appraisal done, having them come back, a valuation expert that then comes back and says, all right, here's the value of the company. This is my determination. I know what I'm doing, and everybody hopefully can accept what that valuation is. When gifting the interest of the next generation, or to other family members, I mentioned this, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this slide, is we really need to consider the federal and the state gift tax rules, the annual gift tax exclusion, the lifetime gifting exclusion, and there's always income tax implications to a plan, because if we do a sale of the business, whether it's to the family members or whether it's to management or whether it's to a third party, there's always income tax consequences of that need to be considered. But when looking at gifting the business to the next generation and that succession plan, we do need to be looking at, annual exclusion gifts. How does it impact your lifetime exemption? A lot of times what I'll do is I'll look at, someone's entire estate, and we'll say, okay, if you do nothing, this is what your estate tax consequence is going to be, whether in New York State or whether with the IRS. Then I'll look at different scenarios and say, all right, if you gift away X amount of shares or X amount of value over the next 5 years, this is what your gift tax consequence is. So those are the kinds of things that we really want to look at, and they really need to be considered as you're putting a plan in place. So if you're passing the business on to the next generation, I've said it a few times, is we want to be able to freeze the value of the business. We want to be able to look at the value of the business and transfer it before there is further appreciation on the business. And there are a number of ways that we can do this, and my materials you're going to see include a lot of detail on the next on the information on this particular slide that I'm not going to get into today because of time, but they are on the materials that are on the webinar here. But one of the things you want to do is you want to be able to transfer the business or to gift the business today using today's value before any further appreciation of the business. Now we know that, or we hope that businesses appreciate over time, and that's why we want to really look at the value of the business today. Number of ways you can do that. A self-canceling installment note is a promissory note that the seller takes back. The promissory note payments are based on expected life expectancy, but it cancels on death of the person that's holding the note. So, that's one way to freeze the value of the business today. There are certain requirements of that allow it to be self-canceling, but that's a way to sell the business to the next generation today for today's value, take back a promissory note, and they only have to pay it so long as you live. Again, there's some requirements of that are on the slides that you'll see. There are several different trusts that are mentioned here, grantor retained interest trust, where someone can sell the interest in the business to a certain kind of trust. That trust pays them an annuity for their lifetime, and then when they pass, that annuity is done, and the asset in the trust is then there for the benefit of the active members of the business. There are installment sales to, we call them intentionally defective grantor trusts. There's a very complex type of transfer, but essentially it's a sale to a type of trust. The trust then pays for the interest over a period of time, and when the individual passes, the promissory note that they have gets passed to the trust, and everything gets canceled out essentially. So it's just another method of freezing the value today, selling the business in exchange for a promissory note, being paid on a promissory note that gets paid into a trust, so that the individual or the trust that is paying for the interest also is receiving the benefit at the end of the day of the business. So these are just some examples. Again, there's more materials on the slides that talk about how to freeze the value of the business, because again, a goal should be, if family succession planning is part of your plan, to do it earlier and to do it before there's more appreciation of the business is an ideal way to accomplish your goals. So I just want to wrap up with, answering my question. So, The initial question is, can it wait? And my position is always it can't wait. You're never too young to start your succession plan. You really need to consider yourself and your family and your employees and your business and what that plan is. And preparing yourself and your business can take a lot of time. And hopefully, at this point in the conversation, you've gleaned that from everything that I've said, is that a plan properly and timely implemented can really have very little impact on your estate. And it can pass the business on to the next generation, while you're still alive and working. And that way you can see the success of the plan itself. So to answer your question is that it can't wait. If you're thinking about succession plans, start thinking now. I have memos and materials that explain the things that you can start doing. But it's never too early to start the plan. So that wraps it up. I know we had a way to get some questions into me, but no one's asked any questions right now. So, and I think my email, actually I know my email is on the last slide here. There we go. My email and my phone number is on the last slide. So if you have any questions, feel free to call or email me. And thank you very much for participating today.